and welcome. I'm Kathleen Johnson. I'm Interim Director for Medieval and Renaissance Studies while Dr. Carol Levin is on for Fulbright in York, England. And before I introduce our speaker, I've got a few announcements. First of all, please help yourself to the refreshments and sign the sign-up sheet, which is now making the rounds officially. I'm happy to announce that Andrew Nichols, the assistant for Medieval and Renaissance Studies program here, has won the Dissertation Fellowship for 2015. This award supports research, including traveling to archives or other costs associated with completing the dissertation at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. I'm also pleased to announce that Paul Strauss has won the Paul A. Olson Travel Award for UNL Medieval and Renaissance Studies program students to complete international travel beyond North America, to archives for research, or to present a paper at a scholarly conference, and he is planning to use it to work on his dissertation. Dr. Steve Bueller, pardon?
That's great. I just saw him give a paper at RSA in Berlin. He did a very wonderful job.
Oh, good. Very good. Dr. Steve Bueller won the Artistic Achievement Award for Literary Arts from the City of Lincoln for the Mayor's Arts Award. So that's another thing. I thought I saw Steve earlier, but I think he was in the hallway. He's vanished. Today, April 1st, is the deadline for submitting your individual undergraduate essay or your undergraduate individual group, or group, creative project. See Andrea Nichols if you still want to turn something in, because time draweth nigh shortly. Okay, also graduate student essays are due to me by 11:59 tonight. My email address is on the Medieval and Renaissance website in the faculty and staff directory, or see me after the program today. Medieval and Renaissance Studies will have a group outing to the play Medea on Thursday, April 16th. There's a pre-play talk and pizza party at 6 p.m. at the Temple Building, followed by the play at 7:30. Students will have a buy one, get one free coupon for this, and there are a healthy stack of these things here. So buy early and often here. Those coupons are good not only for the night of the 16th. If you can't make it that evening, you can still go one of the other nights of the play. So even if you've got class on the 16th or something, take the coupon and go one of the other evenings. Let's see. Oh yes, and then for the pizza party, the request is the RSVP by the 14th, Tuesday the 14th. Today we're very pleased to have Dr. Vladimir Polach, the Frank A. Belousek Distinguished Scholar and visiting professor from the Department of History here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, as our speaker. He earned an MPhil from the Center for Studies in Viking Age and Nordic Middle Ages at the University of Oslo, Norway, and a PhD in Medieval History and the History of Exile from Polacky University in the Czech Republic. With expertise in Czech history, language and literature, Vikings, immigration history, and European history, he brings a rich background to his work here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I hope that he'll say a little bit more about what he's been doing this year after the formal presentation. And now, please help me welcome Dr. Polach, who will speak on the topic, Goodbye to the Vikings.
Good afternoon, or good evening, I'm not sure at 5 p.m. this day. Thank you for the introduction. I'll try to make it within the limit of 45 minutes. If you get keyboard signal something, you can switch to faster the way you speak. I also have the speech printed out, but I'm terrible in reading speeches usually. Get lost within the first half a page. So I try to keep with the pictures and a little bit lost in the reading. Goodbye to the Vikings is a bit provocative title, chosen deliberately. But I was thinking about this yesterday evening that I didn't have anything else to do, but thinking about the Vikings in the popular view, the stereotype of the Vikings. And I think even among the laity, so to say, within the common culture, the popular culture, Vikings are one of the most used symbols and one of the most used topics worldwide. They would be second probably only to the ancient Rome or ancient Greece. But I don't think I know so many movies about the ancient Slavs, or Celtics, or Native Americans, for that matter, or the Southern Native Americans. But it's not only the popular culture which is important, it's also the scholars and the scholarly background about the Vikings. I've been doing this field since the late 70s, late 90s. And I know there are hundreds of papers every year, and lots of books, and actually several peer-reviewed magazines and series to be watched. Now, I'm able to keep the track of the titles, but not the content, and I don't think it's possible within the last decades. And of course, there are the football fans in Minnesota. And there are centers devoted or focusing on Viking studies, not only in Scandinavia, which is something we expect, but also in England, of course, but also in Germany and the rest of Europe. And there are Viking-related research centers in the States, and there is one in Australia, even, which is always fun, interesting. And there are some few scholars of the Vikings in Czech Republic, namely 3. And the scholarship itself is actually rather progressive. It's changed a lot within the last 20 years. There are new methods to be used. And these methods are focusing either on the new, either on the old sources, the sources we've known for hundreds of years, but there are new data also. Thanks partly to archaeology, but thanks also to new reading of old data. Might be gender studies, studies of ideology, studies related to genre of literature or anything else. Especially archaeologists, they use methods today which were completely unknown just 20 years ago. Some of those methods I can't even actually properly name. But I'm always fascinated by the results. Especially now, the Scandinavians are very happy by the global warming because the iceberg over Greenland is disappearing, and they have new sites to dig out. Because the Vikings in Greenland is probably the only group in the world which is happy about global warming. The only problem is we don't know who are the Vikings anymore. The change within the historiography of the Vikings of the last 20 years can be also observed or documented by the disappearance of what I call codifying narratives, broadly accepted summaries about the Viking age, Viking civilizations, Viking culture, Viking mythology, Viking warfare, whatever you put into this Viking label. If you look backwards, and I've chosen, of course, just very, very few examples here. If you look backwards on the last 40 years or the second half of the 20th century, you'll get those widely known, translated, and accepted titles, such as the Holger Ardman, the Swedish archaeologist, the Vikings, which were actually translated even to Russian, even to Czech, to German, to English in the 60s. Probably the most famous, at least when I was a student, was the Wynne Jones' History of the Vikings and his other books related to the Viking Age or England in the Viking Age, again the late 60s. Peter Sawyer, together with his wife Bridget, wrote a couple of books. The two famous ones would be The Age of the Vikings from the 70s and The Kings and the Vikings from the 80s. Also Rosedal, a Danish scholar, published in Danish originally the Vikings in the 80s, also very much translated, was published several times, used worldwide as a textbook, classical textbook even until today. It's not huge, it's got 250 pages in a small paperback edition, which makes it, I believe, so popular among the students. And it goes from the 8th century to the 11th, from the archaeology to the mythology. It covers everything. Such books don't exist anymore. Both climax and end, I would say, of this approach, the holistic approach to the Vikings, but also the stereotypical approach, was the Kulturhistorisk Lexikon for Nordisk Middelalder, the lexicon of the Nordic Middle Ages. It's got 22 volumes. If you were a medievalist in the 80s and 90s, you would pay in gold to have it, because every Norse scholar is supposed to quote and use this lexicon, and it's huge. And it's of course off the market, and if you're lucky you get it for hundreds or thousands of dollars somewhere on the internet. And I have seen scholarly papers written basically from quotations from the lexicon, because it was used in Norway and Sweden and Denmark as the codifying book for the Middle Ages, summing up the Middle Ages knowledge. It's not possible anymore, I guess. In a certain way, a very typical example would be the Cambridge History of Scandinavia, Volume 1, the Prehistory to 1520. That's the, I don't know, I have it in the library, 600 pages, I'd say. Typical Cambridge University Press publication, which is very special, because I believe it was obsolete the day it was printed out. And I bought it. Yeah, you don't want to know the price. And I like the book. It sums up everything. I would say it sums up the scholarly knowledge up to the 80s. It was published 2003. It's already pushed aside, and nobody uses it anymore, not if you go to the details. And there are some more titles I was not able or willing to include. They are very typical in the titles, in the names. The books like Viking Achievement or The Viking World, or the very typical 90s catalogs about old Viking world. It doesn't exist anymore. Today, what you get, and I'm already lost in the. What you get today are usually books focusing on small parts, topics, geographical areas, or books which are trying to bring a new and fresh, different view of the Viking world, Viking culture, whatever. Again, I just put a couple of examples. Erik Christiansen, The Norseman in the Viking Age, is actually summing up on 250 pages the arguments why the word Vikings should not be used. And he's giving a brilliant overview, actually, of the Viking scholarship of the last 30 years, although most of the things he quotes are from the 80s and 90s. Ian Howard did something nobody has done for the previous 100 years, which is kind of surprising. Because he took the invasions of Sweyn the Forbord and Canute the Great, the end of the 10th and beginning of the 11th century. And he did a complete rewriting of the chronology, just by reading the sources. He claims correctly, I don't know, I wasn't able to verify. But he changed the chronology. After 200 years we use it. And I don't even dare to say the results. But Patricia Bulhosa, Portuguese, went to the sagas. And she said, the sources we've been using for hundreds of years, we use them wrong. The attribution is wrong. We use the skaldic poetry as it was an argument of historicity, which is not. I hope to show you some examples. And she even denies the authorship of the Heimskringla, the very fundament of Norwegian scholarship from the 30th century. Karl Felstad is using the expression Holy Vikings, which for many people are a kind of heresy. You can either be a Viking or a holy man, but you cannot be a holy Viking. Except we know there were some, such as the St. Olaf. And he's trying to show, and he does actually show, that the Norse medievalists, the chroniclers, were actually using European patterns and European sources and mimic them in the Scandinavian surrounding. And last but not least, Sami Ghosh is basically doing a deconstruction of Norwegian medieval history by rereading the sources already known. That's what I want to say here. They are not archaeologists. They are not doing genetic research as some other people do. They reread already written word. So the question is, what happened to the Vikings? And I borrowed the title of the speech from a study by Richard Hodges, a British archaeologist, who published an essay in 2002, and the book is dated 2004, and the book is dated 2006, a book with the same name. And he urges here to rewrite the Vikings' impact on the Anglo-Saxon economy in the 9th century. Now that might sound a bit, Viking economy in the 9th century is something crazy. But he's basically documenting the fact that the Viking reigns of the 9th century were not as devastating on English culture and economy as it was supposed for the last 100 years. So he said, well, there's a short essay, it's got like 8-10 pages. He comes to the conclusion, we have to find a new place for the Vikings in the history. Because what we have from the Anglo-Saxons chronicles and sources is basically a church-related propaganda caused by different reasons, not the Viking raids. And he is kind of wondering whether we should still call the Vikings as the ravaging and burning heathens who burned England to the ground. And he offers a different definition, quote, stakeholders in a complex realignment of Latin Christendom in the aftermath of the zenith of the Carolingian Empire, unquote. I'm not sure if it actually makes the picture a bit clearer. But what he's trying to say, the old picture of the Vikings is not working. This is not a quotation, this is my definition, the stereotype of the Vikings. I guess we've been through this in the previous seconds. I'm going through. Pagan. They were not pagan. We know that now. We know they knew Christianity from the 9th century. We know many of them actually got baptized. You know, some of them did baptized several times because they usually got gifts when they go to the church. We know the first Norwegian king to be baptized was actually there in the middle of the 10th century, not the 11th as it was supposed. Some archaeologists argue we could find churches in Norway as early as the beginning of the 10th century, and we can definitely find them in Denmark. We also know they were trading with the Christians and they were aligning them in the wars, which means they had to at least take the cross to take the signal, not the baptism, but somehow they had to be open-minded to Christianity. Warriors. Well, they were not only warriors. This is the biggest problem. Eric Christiansen's thesis is based on the fact that we use the label Vikings on a completely incoherent group of people. They were farmers, they were traders, they were people who lived different lives in the summer, in the winter, or over the seasons. We know some of the heroes of the sagas actually had normal life for 10 years and then became Vikings for a year and they then went back home. We know some of them settled in Iceland, they settled in Greenland, some tried to settle in North America, didn't happen. Some of them got married in England, or France, or Normandy, and lived normal lives before turning Viking again. So the warriors are only a part of it, but being used as a label for the rest. Because of England, Frisia, and France, well, they did go there, but they also did go somewhere else. If you look into the sagas, you realize the word Viking is usually used as a pirate. We know that. And most of the young Vikings, so to say, would first go and raid in Sweden, Denmark, Norway. They were actually, they would never hesitate to attack each other. So to imagine the Vikings as an invasion from Norway to England is just a part of the picture. It's really, really very simplifying picture. They would also, and there's very little documented, conduct raids in what would be northern shore of Poland today, of course, and the Baltic. And unfortunately, we don't have mostly no records about that. I skipped one thing, which should be actually also said. I'm sorry for that. That's my reading of the paper again. The warriors kind of recalls the men. It was up to the gender studies in the late 80s to point out that they were not only men, they were also women among the Vikings and the settlers and the traders and blah, blah. But the most important thing, the interesting thing, according to gender-oriented reading of the sources, and I'm going to show you one example, their role within the society could actually change during the time without much a problem. A man could be a man of his own house for a couple of years, but then he would leave for a season or two, and the woman would take over. Not his son or brother-in-law, but the wife, or actually any woman, strong enough. So if you talk about the gendered role of society as a construct, you can see the society of the North was very flexible in this way. one thing which will be also clear from one of the examples, they didn't only plunder and raid the coast of England, they also fought alongside the English or Anglo-Saxons, and they allied with the Frankish powers as well. Longship and the moment of surprise, that's a topic which occurs repeatedly in the scholarship for the last 50 years. In 793, they suddenly showed up at the northern shore of England, and they plundered Lindisfarne and then Iowa and other monasteries, and surprisingly showed up for the next 100 years almost before they settled. And one thing which was very intriguing was how they find the very one spot. They crossed the ocean and they found Lindisfarne, which is on a very small place. Iowa is an island, a small one, which kind of shows two things. First of all, they knew where they were going. And they knew it most likely because of previous contacts with the Anglo-Saxons. And those contacts were not war-related or raiding-related. They would be trade, even slave trade probably. And for trade, you don't use long ships, you use the other forms of ships. And we also know, we're talking about the ships because the ships are usually used as a describing or kind of the determining factors for the invasion, one of the pull mechanisms. Suddenly they had good ships at the end of the 8th century, so they attacked. But we know they've used a whole scale of different means of transport. They were very capable of adapting them. And they've copied Slavic examples in the Baltic as well. But the key here is they knew the English, they knew the Franks, they had different kind of contacts. They didn't just show up from somewhere, which is the beginning of every Viking-related book. Why suddenly? From where did they come? It's not the demographic. The famous litany of Furore Normanorum Liberamus Domine never existed, but it still keeps occurring in the books. And the last part, they did go as far as Byzantium or Constantinople, if you want. They did go, some few of them, as far as Jerusalem, and they did usually go the northern way through Kiev, what we would call the Ukraine of today. But later in the 10th century and 11th century, and the beginning of the 12th, they would even go the south route, around Portugal, Spain, Gibraltar, and the Mediterranean. They wouldn't call themselves the Vikings anymore, they would call themselves the Crusaders. But they used the knowledge they have gained in the previous years, so it's clear if you look at the sagas. One of the very much disputable thing, of course, is the role of the Varangians, the Eastern Vikings, in the foundation of Kiev, or Russia, when it comes. I haven't seen a book written by a Russian historian in the last 50 years which would not deny the Vikings' involvement in founding Russia. I've heard it's changed in the last 10 years or 15 years, but it's very markedly a huge contrast between the approach of the Swedish historians, because these were mostly Swedish Vikings, Swedish raiders, and the Russian or Soviet historians on the role of the Vikings in the East. I'm not able to answer that question or solve it, but that's why I highlight this part. So the new story of the Vikings. Give you a second to go through. Now the interesting thing, to rewrite the traditional portrait, the stereotype, it doesn't take much of new knowledge. It actually takes only to reread the sources or to use those which are not used in the last years for some reasons, mostly nationalistic one actually. If you remember the list of the what I call disturbing narratives, all but one of the scholars were not Scandinavians. They were English, German, Portuguese. I'm not sure about Erik Christiansen, who we find. I believe it would be Danish or Norwegian. And I did study in 1999, I did start to study in 1999 in Norway, in even that time, Viking studies are very much a question of nationalism. And we had a guy who was leading the department, I'm going to show you in a couple of seconds, who was an Icelander. And I already felt the tension between the Icelandic scholar and the Norwegian scholars. And we were an international group of 20 people from different countries. And our approach was completely different. We had a bit different education and different methods. And some of our questions and our questioning of the sources were not much welcomed by the Norwegians. I call it the assimilation annihilation problem. They always had a dispute about the islands of Orkneys and Faroes, North England. We know there was some population before the Vikings came, the Celtic population of the 6th, 7th century. But nobody knows what happened with those people when the Norsemen came. And of course the English historians always claimed the Vikings killed the indigenous people, the annihilation. The Norwegian historians always claimed they assimilated them. And this approach worked, or the difference worked, or for example today, I guess. So I'd like to give you 3 examples of the rereading of the sources that I see possible. The first is the Otter's voyage. Otter, his name is spelled different ways, is a Norwegian from the end of the 9th century. We know about his story because it's preserved in Anglo-Saxon manuscript. It's not actually a Norwegian source. That's probably why it was not so used so much. It was kept as a part of the Odysseus chronicles, the Vedas. In probably the 80s or 90s, Otter made a voyage from his place somewhere in Holland. I think you can move this one around as you wish. The only thing we know, he was from Halloland, which is the northern part of Norway. And he claimed later on he was living as a farmer, and he was living as basically, if shepherd is the right word. He had a huge flock of elks, actually based his wealth on that. And he was also using trade. And he's venturing north and northeast, not much usual road in the 9th century. He describes places like people like the Finns, or probably the Samis. He talks about the Bjarmeland. Well, the Bjarmeland could be basically anything in this region at this time. The more curious thing, he after he went home, he continued his race, his travel southward, and he describes three important things. He talks about the place of Kalbank, probably, the trade town in the south of Norway, the much more known Hedeby town, or they call it proto-town, in Denmark, clearly showing that the Viking economy in the 9th century was not only based on the raiding, but also on inner trade. And although they did not have towns in the way you would find them in France or England, they were able to set up at least markets, seasonal markets in Norway, actually 45 places ahead of it. Secondly, he's also talking about the travels, and I was emphasizing the ships, and it's very often thought that suddenly, somehow, the Vikings got their ships and are able to cross the ocean to England and to Iceland. But Otter is very clear, and another manuscript from the same book, that he was trying to travel alongside the coast, which was much more safer. And he was probably using the trade ship, not the raiding ship. And last, and that's the most important part, he not only went to England, but he was invited to the king's court. And he spent some time talking to the king, and we actually know the story because it was recorded down on the king's request. Now, this king is Alfred the Great, and he's usually called the Great because he fought the Vikings all the time. And this is one of the many examples we have that the Vikings were not only the warriors fighting the Anglo-Saxons, they were also the traders and people who came to settle and marry and negotiate. The other example is Eilert Skallagrimsson. He's one of the most famous Viking heroes. He's the typical Icelandic national hero. He lived in the 10th century at least, the saga claims so. The saga is more or less a fiction. He's this typical example of what the Viking is. He's a warrior, he is a scout, a poet, he's a sword for hire. He was also a farmer for a long time, and he was a chieftain of his household, which was kind of numerous. And he was Icelander, which is important for Icelanders. Again, he fought with the English, not the British, with the English or Anglo-Saxon at Brunanburh. The Battle of Brunanburh is largely forgotten, but it's said to be the biggest battle in England before Hastings, and it was the one where the Anglo-Saxon actually stopped the Vikings. So a Viking helped to stop the Vikings. Now, this is supposed to be a statue of Eil and his sons. I was there a couple of years ago, took a picture. I don't see either Eil or his sons, but you may be better than me in that. And I didn't know I'm going to use this picture in public, so I apologize for the two goofy faces. But this is Professor Jolvidar Sigurdsson, the Icelander in Norway, and this is Professor Christian Keller, a great archaeologist who posed there. And the interesting thing, this hero figure, and he is really, he killed his first man when he was 7 years old. And when he was 3 years old, he refused to play with his peers, and he said, I want to go to Viking. He's the stereotype of a Viking. And during the later stage of his life, he composed a poem which is called Sonatorek, usually the cry for the sons, because three of his sons died. And he composed basically a mourning song, which is within the genre of Norse plays or songs always described to women. And actually, if you look on his saga using the gender reading, you realize that he is being described as a woman at the end of his life. But not as a woman, but as a socially constructed role of the one who is not able to be a man. He is crying, he is hiding, he is not going outside for a long time, and he composes a poem to praise his dead sons. He dies as a Viking, though. He kills against somebody. And of course, the Icelanders are not too happy about this reading of the story. Skaldic poetry, the third example. Skaldic poetry was always used as the example of historicity and veracity of the sagas. You know the sagas. These are narratives from the 12th and mostly 13th century, describing events of the 9th, 8th, and 10th century. And this 200 years difference, or distance, was always a problem. But the way to use the sagas, if you want to use them as a historical instrument, was to use those parts of the prose which are accompanied by the poetry. Because the Skaldic poetry was supposed to be the ancient one, because of the form, because of the language, because of the fact that we knew some of the poets. Actually, there are more than 200 poets now, or people who composed. And because of some of the stanzas or strophe were used in different sources. Now, this reading of the Skaldic poetry is possible, but you can actually cast some doubts, and I never believed in the Skaldic poetry. And I'm just using one of the most known example here. These are two strophes from the saga of Olav the Sand, the biggest, or not the biggest, one of the typical Norwegian kings of the 11th century. First the Viking, then a king on the throne, Christianized the country, killed, became a saint, and he's got